Voiceover, cold open. Something is wrong with Drake. And I don't mean the kind of wrong you scroll past on Twitter, laugh at for a second, and forget by lunch. I'm talking about the kind of wrong that quietly eats a career alive while the world is too busy clapping to notice the smoke rising behind the curtain. 7 days. That's all it took. 7 days since the Iceman trilogy dropped, and the cracks are already splitting open like glass under pressure. The numbers are slipping. The bots are humming. The label is silent. And somewhere behind closed doors, in rooms most fans will never see, the most commercially dominant rapper of the last 15 years is staring at a balance sheet that does not love him back. This isn't a hot take. This isn't hater commentary. This is a financial autopsy in real time. And by the time you reach the end of this video, you're going to look at Drake completely differently. Because the man who built an empire on flexing pockets is now drowning in red ink, and almost nobody is saying it out loud. So before we go 1 inch deeper into this rabbit hole, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and join this channel family, because what I'm about to walk you through is the kind of breakdown the mainstream music press is too scared to touch. They won't tell you the truth. I will. Stick with me, because the deeper we go, the uglier this gets. Let's set the stage properly, because most people don't understand what they're actually looking at. 1 week ago, Drake didn't just drop an album. He detonated a 3-album carpet bomb. Iceman, Frozen Water, Habitat, and Maid of Honour, all crashing into the marketplace at the exact same moment. 43 new songs. 43. That's not a release strategy. That's a flood. That's a man emptying every chamber of his arsenal in one panicked burst, hoping the smoke alone would be mistaken for victory. And on paper, the plan made sense. Drown the platforms. Suffocate the conversation. Force the algorithm to bow. Because mathematically, with that much new material entering the market on the same day, the appearance of dominance was almost guaranteed. The optics were the point. The actual music? Almost secondary. And that should already tell you everything you need to know about where Drake's head is at right now. But here is where the story turns, and turns hard. The flood didn't drown the competition. It exposed the swimmer. Because the original projections coming out of that Friday morning were enormous. Industry insiders were whispering 750,000 combined units in week 1. The OVO loyalists, the ones who treat every Drake release like a religious holiday, were pushing the number even higher into the 800K range, like they were daring the universe to disagree. And the universe did disagree. Within days, those projections quietly collapsed. The numbers sank into the 600s. And the silence around that drop is louder than anything the bots could ever scream into a comment section. When projections fall by over 100,000 units in 72 hours, that is not a slow start. That is a market rejection in slow motion. And here's the punchline nobody wants to print. When you have to release 43 songs to compete with a man who released 12, you already lost the argument. You just paid more to lose it. Now look closer, because the deeper layer is where the real story lives. Iceman, the centerpiece, the only one of the 3 that actually carries cultural weight, is locking in around 475,000 first-week units. Sounds massive. Sounds like a win. Until you remember the projections were comfortably above 500K, and until you put it next to GNX. Kendrick Lamar dropped 12 songs. No warning. No rollout. No press cycle. No magazine covers. No carefully orchestrated 3-album marketing carpet bomb. He moved 320,000 units with one hand tied behind his back and a first-day tracking window that was barely a window at all. Drake needed 18 songs, a year of build-up, an entire Trilogy ecosystem, and a small army of online defenders to land 475K. Do the math. Per song. Per dollar spent. Per ounce of effort. Kendrick didn't just win the comparison. He humiliated it. And the most damning part is this. If Kendrick had bothered to pad GNX with 6 more filler tracks the way Drake pads everything he touches, this conversation wouldn't even be happening. The gap would be a canyon. And that's the quiet truth the slot machine cannot spin away. Now let's talk about the 2 albums nobody is talking about, because that silence is data. Habitat and Maid of Honour are already slipping out of relevance at a speed that should terrify the people running OVO. A handful of songs from each are clinging to the lower edges of the Hot 100 like fingertips on a ledge, but the projects as full bodies of work? They are vanishing, faster than anyone in the Drake camp expected. And here's where it gets suspicious. When you stare at the streaming patterns for those two albums, the numbers look strangely similar, strangely consistent, strangely smooth, almost like someone is running a pump underneath the surface, keeping the corpse twitching just long enough to look alive. I'm not making accusations. I'm making observations. But when an album has zero cultural footprint, zero viral moments, zero memorable lines being quoted, and yet the streaming counter keeps climbing in eerily even waves, you do the detective work yourself. Something doesn't smell right. And in an industry built on smoke and mirrors, sometimes the smoke is the story. Drake didn't just try to win the week. He tried to break Morgan Wallen's record for most songs on the Hot 100 simultaneously by a single artist. Think about that ambition. Think about the desperation it implies. Because the man whose record he was chasing is the only other artist in modern music more famous for stat padding than for songwriting. That's not a flex. That's a confession. When your benchmark for greatness is a fellow flood merchant, you have already admitted what kind of artist you've become. Here's a memorable line for you, and I want you to sit with it. A man who needs 43 songs to feel tall is a man who already knows he's shrinking. Voiceover. Midpoint pattern interrupt. And before we descend into the financial sinkhole that's about to swallow this entire situation whole, I need you to do something for me. If this kind of unfiltered, no PR script, no label bias breakdown is what you came here for, smash that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Because the part of this story that's coming next is the part nobody on YouTube is brave enough to explain properly. We are about to step inside the room where the real damage is happening. The room where contracts are signed. The room where catalogs are owned. The room where Drake just walked out with empty hands. Stay locked in. This next section changes everything. Now we get to the part that should make every Drake fan stop scrolling and start paying attention. According to reports leaking out of Hits Daily Double and other industry watchdogs, Drake has officially fulfilled the final 3 albums of his $400 million deal with Universal Music Group. Done. Finished. Contract closed. And as of this moment, the biggest commercial rapper of his generation is a free agent. Sounds powerful, right? Sounds like liberation. Sounds like the moment an artist takes back control of his destiny. Except it isn't. Because freedom in the music industry is an illusion, and the receipt for that illusion is hidden in the fine print. Drake may have walked out of the building, but he walked out empty-handed. Every album he has ever made, from So Far Gone in 2009 to Iceman in 2026, every record, every hook, every cultural artifact he ever stamped his name on, belongs to Sir Lucian Grainge and Universal. Not Drake. Universal. They own the masters. They own the publishing leverage. They own the catalog that prints money in perpetuity. And every time a 14-year-old discovers Take Care for the first time on a streaming app 20 years from now, that check lands on a desk Drake will never sit behind. He didn't escape the system. He just finished serving it. And the punchline writes itself. You cannot dismantle the machine by feeding it 3 more albums. Now here's where the financial picture turns from grim to apocalyptic. Iceman wasn't a normal album release. Iceman was a personal investment, a self-funded gamble. A bet Drake placed with his own money, out of his own pocket, against his own future. And the bare minimum estimate of what he poured into that single project is $10 million. $10 million. And I want to be crystal clear when I say bare minimum, because everyone I've spoken to in the production world quietly believes the real number is significantly higher. We're talking about an album that likely cost Drake more to produce than his last 10 albums combined. Studios. Producers, engineers, features, marketing, visual rollouts, behind-the-scenes campaigns, promotional warfare designed to dominate every corner of culture for a single weekend. And the cruelest twist? He poured all of that money into a project whose ownership still flows uphill to Universal. He paid for the meal. They get to eat it. Imagine spending $500 million to produce a film, watching it open to $150 million at the box office, and then having to write a thank you card to the studio for letting you make it. That is the Iceman business model. That is the trap Drake walked into willingly. And here's the part that should chill every aspiring artist watching this video right now. There is almost no realistic mathematical path for Drake to recoup what he spent on Iceman. Not at these streaming margins. Not at this royalty split. Not with this rollout. Iceman is on track to become one of the rarest beasts in modern music history. A massively successful album that lost its own creator money. Write that down. Bookmark it. Because in 20 years, hip-hop business courses will be teaching this case study. So now the question that everyone should be asking and almost nobody is this: why would Drake do that? Why would the man whose entire artistic identity is built around being rich, being protected, being insulated from the struggles of normal artists, voluntarily set fire to $10 million he couldn't get back? And the answer, when you peel the layers, is the saddest part of this entire story. He didn't do it for the art. He didn't do it for the fans. He didn't do it to liberate himself from corporate chains. He did it for leverage. He did it to inflate his own value before walking into the next negotiation. He did it to wave Iceman around like a price tag and shout, "Look how much I'm worth, sign me, sign me, sign me." Iceman wasn't an album. Iceman was a job application. And he typed it with his own $10 million. That's not artistic freedom. That's an audition. And now here is where the desperation becomes visible to anyone with eyes. The OVO media machine is in overdrive trying to inflate Drake's market value before the bidding war that the camp is praying will materialize. You're hearing whispers that Drake is being offered $2 billion. You're hearing other voices push the number to $5 billion. $5 billion. For a music catalog. For a single artist. Let me put that in perspective for you, because the absurdity deserves daylight. Disney bought Lucasfilm and the entire Star Wars universe for around $4 billion over a decade ago. Disney bought Marvel for roughly the same. So according to the most delusional voices in the OVO orbit, Drake, one man with one catalog, should command a higher price tag than Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, Iron Man, Spider-Man, the Avengers, and every Jedi who has ever swung a lightsaber. Combined. Read that sentence again and tell me with a straight face that this isn't a coordinated PR push designed to manipulate the negotiation table. It is theater. And the audience is the next label executive who picks up the phone. The realistic options are far less glamorous than the fantasy numbers suggest. The most probable destinations are Universal, Warner, or Sony. Universal because they already own everything Drake has ever made, and a renewed partnership would let him at least share in the profits of his own past. Warner because his closest collaborators, including Party Next Door, are deeply tied into that ecosystem. Sony because some of his recent allies, including 21 Savage, sit comfortably under that umbrella. But notice what's missing from that list. Notice the door he refuses to walk through. The independent door. The Kanye door. The door that says, "I'll build the machine myself. I'll keep my masters. I'll set my own rules. I'll take less in exchange for owning more." Drake will not walk through that door. He cannot walk through that door. And that refusal is the loudest confession of his entire career. Because here is the cinematic contrast nobody is making bold enough. Kanye West, whatever you think of him personally, walked away from the major label system, embraced independence with both arms, and proceeded to set streaming records, sell out stadium shows, and pull home a bigger personal share of every dollar than the label era ever allowed him. He builds. He owns. He bleeds for his own brand. Drake, in the very same era, given a small taste of freedom, doesn't sprint toward independence. He sprints back toward the cage. He doesn't even pause at the open door. He runs back through it, asking for a slightly nicer bed inside. That is the difference between a lion and a sheep wearing a chain. And in hip-hop, the chain has never been louder than the cage. Voiceover. Investigative escalation. Now, let's get analytical because this is where the story stops being about one rapper and starts being about a pattern. Drake's entire career has been a masterclass in choosing the bag over the building. Every fork in the road, every business decision, every contract signature. He has chosen the immediate check over the long-term ownership stake. And for years that strategy worked because the checks were enormous and the consequences were invisible. But invisible is not the same as non-existent. Consequences accumulate. They compound. They wait. And right now, in the wake of the Kendrick beef, in the wake of the lawsuit nobody respects, in the wake of an album he funded with his own money and cannot fully monetize, those consequences are arriving at the door all at once. Like creditors who finally got tired of waiting in the lobby. You cannot play the role of owner when you sign the paperwork of a worker. You cannot lecture executives about industry power when you handed them the keys to your kingdom for a quick advance. You cannot pretend to be Jay-Z when your entire blueprint was the opposite of his. And Jay-Z, for those who weren't listening, already said it years ago in his own way. The system will let you spend the check. The system will never let you control the leverage. Maybe Drake should have taken that dinner. Maybe Drake should have asked more questions and signed fewer pages. Maybe the bars he aimed at older legends were really just frustrations with a mirror he wasn't ready to face. A man cannot dismantle a house he keeps re-signing the lease to. That is the line. That is the entire video in one sentence. And here's where the legacy question gets brutal. Because Iceman, for everything that's wrong with the business behind it, is still musically the most listenable Drake project of the entire 2020s. Not because it's great. Not because it reinvents him, but because for the first time in years, you can hear a flicker of effort, a pulse of intention, a whisper of the rapper he used to be before he became a content factory. And that is the cruelest irony of all. The album where he finally tried a little harder is the album that may bankrupt him. The album where he sounded a little more awake is the album that exposed how asleep his business instincts have always been. So now Drake is left in the worst possible psychological position for an artist. He knows he can do better. He just doesn't want to, because doing better costs money he doesn't get back. And going back to the assembly line of yearly slop quotas, the For All the Dogs releases, the Habitat and Maid of Honour throwaways, the phoned-in projects propped up by promotional bots and PR puppets, that is the model that pays. That is the model he is racing back to. That is the model the next contract will demand. Iceman is not a turning point. Iceman is a farewell letter to effort. And the saddest part is the fan base may never know the difference. Because the OVO defense machine is so loud, so coordinated, so relentless, that even an obvious commercial underperformance gets repackaged as a triumph by Sunrise. Every dropped projection gets spun. Every quiet streaming pattern gets celebrated. Every critical observation gets dismissed as hate. That's the bubble. That's the bunker. That's the echo chamber that Drake has been living inside for so long, he genuinely seems to believe the walls are the sky. But the walls are not the sky. They never were. And somewhere outside that bunker, Kendrick Lamar is sitting in absolute silence, doing absolutely nothing, and still casting a shadow over this entire week. Because that is what real cultural weight looks like. You don't have to flood the market when your presence already saturates it. Now, let's talk about something almost nobody is willing to say out loud. Drake's bargaining position is significantly weaker than the OVO megaphones want you to believe. And the reason is brutally simple. Universal already has what they need from him. They got the final 3 albums. They got Iceman, the only one with cultural staying power. They got Habitat and Maid of Honour, 2 projects they can quietly cycle through playlist promotion for years to come. They got the catalog. They got the masters. They got the publishing river that will keep flowing whether Drake re-signs or not. So why on earth would Universal sprint to the table with a $500 million offer, let alone a $2 or $5 billion fantasy, when they already own the goose and the eggs? They don't need to chase. They can wait. They can lowball. They can let Warner and Sony bid first, and then decide whether the price is worth matching. And Drake, sitting on the other side of that table with a $10 million hole in his pocket and an Iceman track literally titled Bees on the table, is in no position to play hardball. He's in a position to play prayer. That isn't a negotiation. That's a sermon delivered to people who stopped attending church. And here is the deeper question the average viewer should sit with. What does it say about modern hip-hop that the most commercially dominant rapper of his generation built an empire on numbers, but never on ownership? What does it say about the genre that the loudest voice in the room rented his megaphone instead of buying it? What does it say about the culture that we measured greatness in first-week sales for 15 years and never once asked whose pockets those sales actually filled? Drake's collapse isn't just a story. It's a mirror held up to every artist who ever traded equity for ego. Every signer who chose the bigger advance over the smaller share with bigger upside. Every star who confused fame with freedom. And the mirror is not flattering. It never was. We just didn't want to look. Hip-hop owes Drake credit for the numbers he generated. But hip-hop also owes itself the honesty to admit that numbers without ownership are just expensive applause. Now zoom out one more time, because the timing of all of this is the part that turns it into pure cinema. Drake is sitting in the red. Drake is bargaining from weakness. Drake is publicly trying to project strength while privately calculating losses. And looming somewhere on the horizon, like a storm forming over an ocean Drake desperately hopes stays calm, is Kendrick Lamar. The man who already won the war. The man who already shifted the cultural narrative. The man who already moved 320,000 units with 12 songs and a smile. The man who has not made a public move in months, but whose silence somehow speaks louder than every Drake billboard combined. If Kendrick decides to step back outside, if Kendrick decides this is the moment to drop something new, every projection number Drake is currently bleeding over becomes irrelevant overnight. The conversation flips. The leverage evaporates. The bargaining chips melt. And every label executive currently weighing how much to offer Drake will pause, pick up a different phone, and start asking different questions. That is the sword hanging over this entire negotiation. That is the ghost in the boardroom. And Drake knows it. That's why the trilogy was rushed. That's why the flood was forced. That's why the projections were inflated. He was trying to stake a flag before the real storm rolled in. But you cannot outrun a storm by running in circles. You can only get more tired. Voiceover, reflective final act. So, where does this leave us? Where does this leave Drake? Where does this leave the genre? Because what we are watching in real time is not just the financial unraveling of one rapper. It is the slow unmasking of an entire business model. A model built on flooding markets instead of building monuments. A model built on chasing checks instead of constructing catalogs you actually own. A model built on confusing volume with value. And Drake, for all his cultural impact, for all his hits, for all his decade-long dominance of the streaming era, may go down as the cautionary tale that finally broke the spell. Because when the most successful commercial rapper of his generation ends his biggest contract with no masters, no catalog ownership, a self-funded album bleeding red, and a fan base that has been told for years to mistake quantity for quality, the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. You can be the most streamed artist in the world and still be the man losing money in the room. And let that sink in, because that one line might be the most expensive sentence in modern hip-hop history. Drake's future from this point forward depends on choices he has historically been bad at making. Choices about ownership. Choices about restraint. Choices about quality over quantity. Choices about the kind of artist he wants to be remembered as when the streaming numbers fade and only the music remains. Will he sign back with Universal under slightly better terms and continue the same cycle that brought him here? Will he chase Warner or Sony in search of a freshly painted version of the same cage? Will he, in some shocking plot twist nobody expects, look at Kanye's blueprint and finally try the independent road he has spent 15 years avoiding? The smart money says no. The smart money says he runs back to what he knows. Because patterns are heavy, and a man who has spent a decade and a half choosing the check is not going to suddenly grow a love for the long game when his bank account is bleeding.
He will sign.
He will smile. He will release another flood. And the cycle will continue. Until one day, it can't. And that day might be closer than anyone realizes. So before I let you go, I need you to do one last thing for me. If you've made it all the way to the end of this breakdown, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. You think deeper. You see further. You don't fall for the smoke. So hit that subscribe button right now, ring the notification bell, and join this channel family for real, because we don't just cover hip-hop here. We dissect it. We investigate it. We tell you the stories the labels would rather you never hear. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Do you believe Drake re-signs with Universal? Do you think Warner or Sony makes a serious play? Do you think there's any universe at all where he tries independence? Or do you think this is the beginning of the slowest, quietest, most expensive fall hip-hop has ever witnessed? I read every comment. I want to know exactly where you stand. And one more thing before you go, because the story doesn't end here. It actually gets worse. Because while Drake is sitting in the red trying to negotiate the next chapter of his career, there are whispers that Kendrick Lamar is preparing something massive. Something bigger than GNX. Something nobody is ready for. And if those whispers turn into reality, everything you just heard in this video becomes the appetizer to a meal Drake never wanted to sit down for. You are not going to want to miss what's coming next. Click the video on your screen right now, because the next chapter of this saga is already writing itself, and the ink is darker than anyone expected. Stay sharp. Stay loyal. Stay locked in. This is this channel. And the truth doesn't get scared. It gets louder.